Margaret Webber was already stumbling through sleet on Bond Street before the first carriage lamp was lit, one arm full of rose boxes wrapped in cream paper and twine, the other pressed hard against her ribs where a snapped corset bone had worked through linen and skin. Her breath came in white bursts. Her fingers had gone numb inside split gloves. The sleet struck her lashes and melted into her eyes. She missed the curb by half a step. Her right boot slid, the parcels pitched forward out of her grasp and burst open against the edge of the street, satin ribbons and pale petals dropping into brown water as two passing gentlemen paused, looked down at her on her knees, and then looked away. A woman beneath a fur-trimmed hood drew her gown aside so the hem would not brush Margaret's shoulder. A boy with newspapers under his arm laughed once, not cruelly, only reflexively, as if a young woman scrambling in the gutter before dawn were merely another London sight. Margaret gathered each box with both hands, wiped street grit off the paper with the cuff of her sleeve, and rose too quickly. The torn place at her side burned. She steadied herself against a post, jaw tight, and counted silently to 10 until the dizziness passed. The florist's errand had been simple when it was spoken in a warm drawing-room. Collect the roses. Do not bruise them. Do not be late. In sleet, in half-boots mended 3 times with waxed thread, with an empty stomach folding in on itself, simplicity had teeth. She crossed to the awning of Bellamy and Sons and held the worst of the damp away from the topmost box with her body while the apprentice checked the card tags by candlelight. He did not invite her inside. He stood in dry boards and wool, and she stood in runoff from the roof, water dripping from the ends of her dark hair to her collar. Mrs. Webber required white tea roses, he said, peering at the script. Not blush. Tell her we had no more fit for ladies. His gaze moved over her plain brown cloak, the frayed seam at her shoulder, the old cuff turned once, and hand-stitched. He added, lower, she said her maid was slow. I begin to see the truth. Margaret kept her eyes on the tags. Her voice emerged level despite the cold stiffening her mouth. I am not her maid. He gave a small shrug that settled nothing. You carry as one. She did not answer. 2 ladies entered behind her trailing amber perfume and wet silk. One of them, all pearls and pink cheeks, glanced at Margaret's soaked skirt and whispered, not quietly enough, some households keep relations only because it is cheaper than charity. The other lady smiled with practised pity. Margaret picked up the boxes before either could watch her flinch. Her gloves had split entirely at the first knuckle, and thin red crescents marked the skin where twine had bitten in. She thanked the apprentice because gratitude cost less than argument, turned into the street again, and bore the flowers toward Hanover Square as if they were crystal and not another weight tied to her name. By the time she reached the Weber townhouse, sleet had become fine, hard rain that worked through wool and linen and found every seam. Her shawl smelled of lamp smoke from attic nights and old tallow. Water had crept into the right boot through the cracked sole and now chilled her stocking with each step. She had eaten 2 crusts since dawn, one while carrying coal scuttles from basement to second floor, one standing at the scullery sink while Mrs. Davies was not looking. Hunger made her hands unsteady and her hearing oddly sharp. Wheels on cobbles, a porter cursing at frozen hinges, a church bell 2 streets away marking an hour she had no power to keep. She kept her pace, even. She kept the boxes level. She kept her palm pressed at intervals to the torn place beneath her stays and felt fresh damp there that was not rain. She did not permit herself a sound. In the vestibule mirror, flashed by chance as the door opened, she saw what others named plain. Thin face, too pale in winter, dark hair that escaped its pins in rough strands, eyes too large and too watchful. She had learned in this house that plainness was a verdict spoken over women who couldn't afford defence. She climbed the narrow service stairs because she was forbidden the front staircase when guests were expected. On the landing she paused by the small shelf where discarded account slips were stacked for fire kindling. Without thinking, she straightened them by size and date, edges aligned, numbers memorised in one pass. She had done that since childhood. Her father had once laughed softly and called it her soldier's mind. The memory struck clean and quick, then vanished under the immediate demand of work. Mrs. Weber entered the dressing chamber in a rush of blue silk and rose water, and the room rearranged itself around her as rooms always did. The fire was built high for her comfort. 2 maids stood waiting with pins between their lips. Lucinda and Anne, Margaret's stepsisters, occupied the chaise and argued over gloves while eating sugared almonds from a silver dish. Margaret set the roses down on the side table and reached for the combs. "You are late," Mrs. Weber said without looking at her. "If these petals are bruised, I shall deduct the loss from your allowance." Margaret had not received an allowance in 3 years. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "Lower," Mrs. Weber snapped as Margaret laced the back of her bodice. "Do you intend to strangle me?" Lucinda turned, smiling at her own reflection. "Perhaps she wishes to attend the musicale in your place. She does stare at the guests when she thinks no one sees." Anne laughed, bright and mean as cut glass. "No gentleman notices girls with ink on their fingers." Margaret's fingers did bear old ink stains near the nail beds, impossible to scrub out in winter. Mrs. Weber noticed and caught Margaret's wrist hard. "You will keep behind the screens tonight. You will refill glasses and carry wraps. You will not speak unless addressed. If anyone asks, you are a poor relation we tolerate. Are we clear?" The grip tightened. Pain flashed up Margaret's arm. "Yes, ma'am." "Smile when spoken to." Mrs. Weber released her with a slight push that sent her against the dressing table. "A sour face makes everyone uncomfortable." Margaret folded the hand that shook into her skirt and smoothed the silk at her stepmother's shoulder. She fastened the pearl drop at Mrs. Weber's throat. She pinned Lucinda's hair. She hemmed Anne's cuff where the seam had come loose. She did all of it standing straight, while blood dried in a thin line beneath her stays, and the room warmed every woman in it except her. By evening the drawing-room shone with candlelight multiplied in mirrors, and music threaded through the house in disciplined, expensive waves. Guests arrived wrapped in velvet and fox fur. Footmen took cloaks. Crystal chimed softly against crystal. Margaret stood in the shadowed space behind the carved screen near the pianoforte, close enough to hear every compliment and every slight, far enough to be unnamed. She handed out warmed shawls. She collected empty cups before rings could stain walnut tables. She carried a tray of negus so steadily that no one saw her wrist tremble. Once, when she turned too quickly, the torn place at her side opened again, and heat slid under the bandage she had made of old muslin, but she did not stop. A servant who stopped was noticed. A poor relation who was noticed became a story. Through the fretwork she glimpsed the room in fragments, jewelled hands lifting glasses, a colonel's medals catching flamelight, Lucinda's laughter thrown like confetti toward a cluster of men, Mrs. Weber bowing as if benevolence was stitched into every fold of her gown. Names drifted through the music and settled like ash. Lord Benedict Ashford had arrived. The Duke of Hartrow had accepted despite his reputation for refusing half the season's invitations. Margaret kept her eyes on the tray. She was hungry enough that the smell of roast almonds turned her stomach. She was cold enough that the back of her neck ached. She was tired enough that the floor seemed to tilt when she stood still. Yet, when Mrs. Webber passed behind the screen and murmured without moving her lips, "Remember what you are," Margaret answered with perfect softness, "Yes, ma'am," and stepped farther into shadow, obeying the law of that household with the last intact piece of herself. She would work, she would endure, and she would not let them see her break. The quadrille ended in a measured sweep of bows and curtsies, and the room broke into that low, bright murmur that always followed performance, a sound like silk drawn over stone. Margaret moved from shadow to shadow with a fresh tray of cups, her shoulders kept narrow so she would not brush brocade sleeves, her eyes lowered to the silver rims she must not chip. A gentleman near the mantel, cheeks pink with wine, asked Mrs. Webber in a carrying voice whether the dark-haired girl behind the screen was the same Miss Webber who had once translated a line of Virgil for his wife at supper. Miss Webber's laugh was soft, indulgent, entirely practised. "My stepdaughter has a habit of repeating what she hears. It can give a false impression of learning." The circle around her gave the small, polite smiles that kept drawing rooms smooth. Lucinda, seated with one ankle crossed over the other so that everyone might admire her slipper roses, added, "Margaret is dutiful with lists and dusting cloths. We do not burden her with anything requiring judgment." Anne pressed a sugared violet to her tongue and said, "She is happiest where she is useful." Margaret felt the words strike with the same old precision, each one placed where it would do maximum work and leave no mark visible enough to protest. She offered negus to the very lady who had laughed at Bond Street mud on her hem. The lady accepted without looking at her face. At the card table, an older barrister with a silvering temple frowned over his hand and peered up at Margaret as she replaced the empty decanter. "Weber," he said, half to himself. "I knew a Weber in Chancery, methodical fellow, a mind for figures." Mrs. Weber did not turn her head. "My late husband exhausted his mind and his purse in equal measure," she said, smiling at the cards in her hand. "We keep our household now by practical means." Margaret stood very still while the man grunted and reached for his trick. The scent of beeswax, claret, and roses pressed close around her. Her side throbbed under her stays where the bone had broken skin that morning. The wound had begun to stick to linen. She could feel it each time she breathed too deeply. Hunger made every sweet smell in the room turn bitter at the back of her throat. She crossed to the musician's table, set down 3 glasses, and heard Lucinda say to a cluster of girls, "One cannot choose one's relations, only where to place them." Anne replied, "Preferably out of sight." Margaret did not break stride. She had learned the geometry of this house years ago. Centre belonged to beauty and money. Edge belonged to those who carried trays. As she passed the escritoire in the little antechamber, her glance caught on a ledger half hidden beneath invitation cards, and memory rose not as comfort but as force, immediate and bodily, as if the old nursery of facts still breathed behind her ribs. Her father's hand had been narrow and exact, the loops of his letters so precise that clerks in chambers copied his forms to improve their own. He had taught her to sharpen quills, to weigh words in contracts, to mistrust numbers that arrived without source. "Read the margin, Maggie," he had said, tapping the side of a page while rain struck the study panes in patient sheets. "A debt hides in the margin before it walks into the line." She had been 14 then, knees ink-smudged, Latin grammar open beside his briefs, and he had looked at her as if intellect were not an adornment in a girl, but a tool she had every right to keep. Her mother had already been gone a year, fever taking her in 3 nights, and the house had gone too quiet for a child and a widower who both listened for footsteps that would never return. When Mrs. Webber entered their lives, she came scented with lavender and reason. She praised the draperies. She spoke gently to servants. She told him he worked too hard and deserved warmth. Margaret had wanted to distrust her and had hated herself for the wanting. 2 years later, with bills mounting after a failed investment tied to railway speculation, her father signed a debt transfer in his own study, saying it was a temporary instrument that would preserve the house until one case settled in spring. He had read the first pages. He had trusted the explanatory note pinned on top. He had not read the appended renewal clauses buried in smaller hand. Margaret had seen his signature tremble only once, the night he woke coughing, and could not stop. He died before spring briefs were heard. Morning crepe had not yet faded when Mrs. Webber moved the household accounts from his desk to her dressing room and announced that grief required efficiency. Efficiency sold Margaret's mother's library by crate, sermons, poems, 2 volumes of Plutarch with annotations in a woman's script, a French dictionary with pressed cornflowers between the pages. Efficiency converted Margaret's dowry to operating reserve. Efficiency replaced her room with Lucinda's piano and sent Margaret to the attic under a sloped roof where frost drew fern patterns on the inside of the pane. In company, Mrs. Webber called this arrangement generous. "The child is plain and not robust," she told callers. "Marriage is unlikely. We give her purpose." Margaret had been standing with the coal scuttle in her hands when she first heard it. She had not dropped the coal. She had gone upstairs and copied every account line she could access into a notebook she hid beneath loose floorboard planks, each figure dated, each transfer traced, because grief had teeth and memory was the only blade left to her. A violin changed key in the drawing room. The party swelled towards supper. Margaret carried shawls to the receiving chairs by the doors and found Anne waiting there with 2 friends, cheeks flushed with amusement. Anne lifted one shawl between finger and thumb. "Not this one! It smells of smoke!" She looked directly at Margaret. "Take yours off as well. The fringe is presentable from a distance, and Miss Felton chills easily." Margaret unclasped the worn wool from her own shoulders and passed it over without a word. Cold reached immediately through the thin bodice at her back. Lucinda arrived a moment later and touched Margaret's sleeve with mock concern. "What happened to your gloves?" She did not wait for an answer. "Never mind. Stand by the cloak stand and do not show your hands. It disturbs people." They moved away, bright as painted porcelain, and Margaret remained where she had been placed, fingers hidden in skirt folds, nails raw and reddened where water and lye had split skin. The sisters had taken in increments and with laughing mouths. First her mother's dressing table because Lucinda required a larger mirror, then the blue winter mantle because Anne liked the cut and said dark colours made Margaret look sickly in any case. Then the little silver vinaigrette engraved with an M, then the cameo pin, then the last pair of kid slippers that had not leaked. What they did not take, Mrs. Webber priced and subtracted from invented debts. Candles, thread, soap, doctor's visit for a fever that had passed without medicine. Margaret had signed receipts she was not permitted to read and copied them later from memory, line by line, into the hidden book. Tonight Mrs. Webber drifted from group to group in peacock blue silk, accepting praise for her musicale and tossing little truths shaped like kindness into every conversation. "My stepdaughter is not form for society, poor thing. She is useful in the background. She is lucky with us." Margaret heard each one while she lifted cloaks and folded cuffs, and each sentence laid itself atop old ones until the weight became familiar enough to carry. A young matron near the supper room asked for hot water, and then, seeing Margaret's face in proper light for the first time, softened her tone. "You are unwell." Margaret kept her gaze on the silver kettle. "No, madam." "Your cheek is hollow." "The rooms are warm," Margaret said. "I am only overheated." The lie came easily. Truth in this house had always required witnesses, and witnesses had always preferred comfort to correction. She returned to the screen and resumed her post, while a tenor began an Italian air no one listened to. Her stomach cramped hard enough to bend her. She straightened before anyone could mark it. At the far side of the room, Mrs. Webber caught her eye and made a tiny downward motion with 2 fingers, in order to fade farther from sight. Margaret obeyed. Even obedience had become tactical. If she preserved the appearance they demanded, she kept access to drawers, keys, papers, account books set carelessly open after midnight. She could endure 100 humiliations for one clear ledger line. Endurance had become arithmetic. When at last she was sent to the service passage for more coal scuttles, the corridor struck her with sudden cold and the clean smell of stone, and she stood for a moment with her palm against the wall, head bowed, willing the pulse at her side to settle. Mrs. Davies came up from the kitchen steps, carrying a basket of plates, and stopped short when she saw Margaret's colour. The housekeeper's face was lined and blunt, her cap always a little crooked, her sympathy always disguised as instruction. "You are white as tallow," she muttered. "Sit on that chest while I am not looking." Margaret sat because her knees had begun to shake. Mrs. Davies set the basket down, tore a heel from a loaf wrapped in cloth, and pressed it into Margaret's hand without meeting her eyes. "Chew, slow. If you faint in the passage, she will blame the silver." Margaret's throat tightened unexpectedly. She nodded and ate in small, careful bites, while Mrs. Davies adjusted a stack of folded napkins that did not require adjusting. "She made inquiries this afternoon," the older woman said, voice low, "at Pritchard's office, about extending the note against your father's chambers another quarter." Margaret swallowed and felt the bread sit warm and heavy in an empty belly. "I know." Mrs. Davies looked at her then, sharp and brief. "You know! She left the draft on her escritoire while Lucinda tried on pearls." Margaret wiped crumbs from her glove with her thumb. "The signature line was copied from an old brief. The clerk at Pritchard's has accepted copied signatures before. The amount was amended in different ink." Mrs. Davies gave a long breath through her nose, half anger, half weary admiration. "You keep all this in your head." Margaret touched the side of her skirt where, beneath the lining, a narrow pencil stub rested in a stitched pocket. "Not only in my head." Footsteps sounded at the top of the passage. A maid hurried down with a tray and said that more lamps were needed in the conservatory corridor. Mrs. Davies straightened at once, practical mask returning. "Back up, then. Shoulders square. No one pities a bent back except to step on it." Margaret rose, set the empty crust cloth neatly beside the basket, and lifted the coal scuttle. Her body still ached, her side still burned, her boots still held cold water, but her mind had sharpened. Figures aligned themselves as she climbed. Dates, sums, initials. The servant's bell rang once, brisk and metallic, and she turned toward it with the same quiet face she had worn all evening, carrying heat to rooms where she was never meant to stay. The servant's bell rang again before she reached the conservatory corridor, a hard metallic peal followed by another, then a rapid clatter of steps that did not belong to any maid in Mrs. Webber's household. Margaret set the coal scuttle down by the warming grate and turned as a man in Ashford livery came through the narrow passage at speed, rainwater darkening his shoulders, his hat in his hand, his breath sharp with cold. He looked first to the footman at the pantry door, found only kitchen boys and 2 startled maids, then fixed on Margaret because she was nearest, and because urgency had no time for rank. "You," he said, already pulling a folded sheet from his inner coat. Wax seal, black and silver, impressed with the Hartrow crest. "By order of his Grace, the Duke of Hartrow, his nephew has left the drawing-room. Child 7 years, dark coat, with brass frog closures. Distressed. Any servant finding him is to fetch a footman at once, and do nothing else." He held out the paper. She took it automatically, fingers leaving faint damp marks on the edge. The hand was angular, the strokes exact, written in haste but not disorder. "Find the child, send for Mr. Hale or any Ashford footman immediately. No one is to handle the boy. No delay." Margaret looked up. "When?" The messenger's jaw tightened. "Moments ago, someone in the card-room spoke of the late Duchess. The boy heard. He ran through the west door." Voices rose from the far end of the corridor. Mrs. Webber's soprano laugh rang once, then cut. A maid whispered, "The guests are searching the front lawn." Margaret handed the paper back. "The west side leads to the winter garden." The messenger had already turned. "Fetch a footman," he repeated, as if she were dull, as if every woman in service forgot words as soon as men spoke them. He vanished toward the main stairs. Margaret stood 1 second longer, hearing all the house at once. Violin from the drawing-room, doors opening, men calling down hallways with forced cheer that concealed alarm, the low boom of wind at the conservatory panes. The clock in the back hall struck 10:30. She should have gone for a footman. She should have carried coal where she had been sent and left noble panic to noble hands. Instead, she lifted her skirts and ran toward the west corridor, boots striking stone, the old wound at her side pulling with each breath. Rain had begun to drum against the glass roof as she pushed through the baize door into air that smelled of wet earth, orange peel, and extinguished lamps. The winter garden held only dim wall sconces and moonlight blurred by weather. Rows of dormant citrus in painted tubs, iron benches, the long central path of gravel silvered with sleet that had blown in through an unlatched vent. "Master Julian," she called, keeping her voice steady, not loud enough to frighten a hiding child. "It is Margaret Weber. I have dry linen. You are not in trouble." No answer came. She moved between the tubs, listening for the smallest sound. There, a sharp intake of breath near the east doors, then the brittle crunch of glass. She rounded the tall laurel and saw him half kneeling, half sitting beside a shattered cloche, one gloved hand pressed to his chest, the other bare and held away from his body in rigid shock. He was very still, in the way frightened children were very still, as if movement might worsen what had already happened. His eyes were wide and dry. "Do not move," she said at once, dropping to the gravel. "You are cold, that is all. You are cold and cut, and we shall mend one thing, and then the other." He swallowed. "I broke it." "Glass can be replaced." She glanced over his shoulder. No deep wound, no blood on his coat, only a bright line across the heel of his palm, with scattered smaller scratches where shards had kissed skin. Painful, frightening, but slight. Relief passed through her so quickly she nearly swayed with it. She looked back to him. "Show me." He shook his head once, jaw hard with effort not to cry. "Uncle says, men do not howl." "Men do not," she said softly, already tearing a strip from the inner petticoat hem with both hands. "Boys may breathe as loudly as they please." That won her one startled blink. She held out her own palm, scarred with old needle pricks and a fresh twine cut. "Match my hand. Flat. Good." He copied her. She wrapped the linen around his hand with efficient turns, pressure firm enough to stop seepage, gentle enough not to sting more than necessary. His shoulders dropped by a fraction. Somewhere behind them a door banged in the wind. She looked toward it, then back at the child. "Can you stand if I clear the pieces first?" He nodded. She slid broken glass away with the edge of a clay potsherd, making a path to the bench. Her sleeve dragged through sleet that had blown in and soaked to the elbow. She guided him up, one hand light at his back, and set him on iron slats still faintly warm from afternoon sun that no one now remembered. "Stay here, feet tucked under. Tell me where it hurts, besides your hand." "Nowhere." "Good. Then we have won half the battle." She reached for a second strip of linen to secure the knot. Boots sounded on gravel behind her, heavy, fast, decisive. Not servant boots. She rose instinctively, turning with wet cloth in her hand, and saw the Duke of Hartrow in the doorway between orange trees, rain tracking from his coat hem to the stones, face carved into the hard stillness of a man who had built his life on command and found command briefly useless. For one suspended breath she registered details in fragments: broad shoulders under black wool darkened by weather, bare head, dark hair slicked back by rain, cravat loosened as if tied in haste, eyes the colour of storm water fixed first on the child, then on her hands, then on the torn strip of petticoat hanging from her skirt. He moved 3 strides forward and stopped at the edge of the glass she had already pushed aside. "Leave him," he said. His voice was low and cut cleanly through the rain. "The surgeon is coming." Margaret had begun to kneel again before he finished. "He is bleeding now, Your Grace." The words left her mouth plain, uncurtsied, stripped of the cushioning phrases she was expected to provide. She tied the linen knot, and only then felt the shock of what she had done. She had contradicted a duke in his own cadence, with no permission and no witness to soften it. Heat climbed her throat despite the cold on her skin. She kept her eyes on the child's hand. "There," she said to Julian quieter. "Tighter than I prefer, looser than your uncle would prefer. We shall call it sensible." The boy gave a breath that might have been the beginning of a laugh and looked to his uncle for judgment. Hartrow did not answer at once. He stepped closer, crouched before Julian, and held out his own hand, palm up. "Show me." Julian displayed the bandage without speaking. The Duke examined the wrap, thumb testing pressure at the wrist, then looked over the knot once more. Approval did not soften his face. It altered only the angle of his jaw by a degree she might have imagined if she had not been trained by necessity to read tiny shifts in dangerous rooms. "Can you walk?" he asked the boy. Julian nodded. "To my study, not the drawing-room." "Yes, uncle." Hartrow stood and turned to Margaret fully for the first time. Rainwater had beaded on his lashes. A pale scar ran from the hinge of his right jaw to the edge of his collar, old and fine, tugging faintly when he spoke. "Who told you to handle him?" She met his gaze because lowering it now would look like guilt. "No one, Your Grace." "The order stated otherwise." "The order reached me in the passage. The child was nearer than a footman." A pause. Wind rattled the glass above them. He looked down at her sleeve, soaked and streaked with garden soil, at her knuckles reddened from moving shards, at the damp, dark line along her bodice where old blood from her side wound had wicked through fresh cloth. His attention felt like a physical weight, precise and unsparing. "You are injured," he said, "not a question." "It is slight." "Liar!" The word was not loud. It struck harder for being even. "Your hand is cut. Your sleeve is wet through. You are shaking." Margaret realised she was shaking, not from fear alone. Cold had reached marrow. Hunger had gone beyond ache into a dull, buzzing emptiness. She clasped her hands at her waist to still them and failed. "I am functional, Your Grace." His mouth moved a fraction, not quite a smile. "That was not what I asked." He shifted his attention back to Julian. "Look at me." The boy did. You will walk with Harker to my study. You will sit by the fire. You will permit the surgeon to inspect your hand. You will say nothing to guests." Julian's small chin lifted in imitation of adult gravity. "Yes, uncle." Hartrow raised 2 fingers. A footman appeared in the doorway as if conjured by discipline alone. "Harker, take him!" The footman bowed, wrapped Julian in a heavy cloak, and led him out along the cleared path. Julian looked back once at Margaret, then forward again, following orders with the stiff dignity of children born to rooms where every word was witnessed. When they were gone, the winter garden seemed larger and colder, rain ticking on glass in thin, relentless lines. Hartrow remained where he was, gaze returning to her with an intensity that made the space between them feel measured, charged, unavoidable. "Your name," he said. "Margaret Webber." "Stepdaughter to Mrs. Webber." It was statement, not inquiry. "Yes, Your Grace. How long have you served this house?" The question carried an edge she could not pass. Suspicion, perhaps, or simple accounting. "Since my father died." "As family or as labour?" She hesitated. Truth here might be seized, twisted, returned as insolence. Yet he had already named what others refused to name. "As labour, when convenient," she said. "As family, when display requires it." His eyes did not leave her face. "You answer directly." "I answer accurately." The rain intensified, drumming harder overhead, 1,000 small blows on the glass roof. Somewhere in the house a woman laughed too brightly, then stopped, as if reminded that crisis still stood in the corridor. Hartrow took one slow step closer, not enough to threaten, enough to make retreat visible if she chose it. She did not move. "When my messenger gave instruction," he said, "you chose to disobey. I chose speed. At personal risk. At a child's need." Another pause, longer this time. He looked at the torn edge of her petticoat again, then at the blood smear on the linen knot she had tied. When he spoke, his voice had dropped further, roughened at the edges by weather and restraint. "Come inside!" The command carried the weight of habit. It also carried unmistakably protection. Margaret felt the old reflex rise to refuse any order on principle, then felt her teeth begin to chatter and accepted that pride did not warm skin or close wounds. She inclined her head once. "Yes, Your Grace." He did not turn away first. He waited until she stepped beside him onto the gravel path, and only then matched his pace to hers as they crossed the winter garden threshold back toward the lighted house where rank ruled every room and where, for the first time in years, she had spoken as if her words belonged to her. She crossed the threshold beside him, and the warmth of the corridor struck her wet sleeves like a reprimand. Candlelight ran along polished panelling. Voices from the drawing room rose and fell in strained waves. No music now, no practiced laughter. The house had shifted from display to management in the space of minutes, and every servant moving through the passages wore the same tight expression, as if one misstep might cost a place. Hartrow did not look at her as they walked. He said, "To my study." "Yes, Your Grace." At the first turning she veered toward the servant's stare by instinct, toward coal dust and anonymity, and his hand caught her forearm just above the wrist. Not rough, unyielding. "Not that way." She lifted her eyes to his face. Rain still clung to the ends of his hair. "Mrs. Webber will require—" "I did not ask what Mrs. Webber requires." He released her at once and continued forward. She followed because refusal in that corridor would become spectacle, and spectacle in that house always found its way back to her skin. They entered a smaller passage lined with family portraits gone dim under old varnish. Then a heavy walnut door opened by a footman before the Duke reached it. The study beyond held a deep fire, 2 lampstands turned high, and a child perched on the edge of a leather settee with a grey wool blanket around his shoulders. Julian's boots did not touch the carpet. His uninjured hand gripped the blanket so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. Harker stood behind him, broad and silent, eyes fixed on the opposite wall in that trained servant posture that meant he had seen too much and would report none of it unless compelled. Julian saw Margaret first and straightened. "You came back." She kept to the door until Hartrose spoke. "Mr. Vale is delayed by weather. He will be here shortly." The child's gaze moved from his uncle to the bandage on his own hand and back again. "Am I in disgrace?" "No," Hartrose said. "One word. Absolute." Julian swallowed and nodded, but his shoulders stayed high and rigid beneath the blanket. Margaret had seen that same stiffness on boys in court corridors waiting, while adults argued over their futures in language children were never meant to hear. She took one step closer. "May I check the wrap, Your Grace, only to be certain the pressure is even?" Hartrose's eyes dropped to her cut knuckles, then to the stain darkening the cuff at her side. "Sit first." She did not realise she was swaying until he named it. She lowered herself to the nearest chair because her knees offered no argument left to make. The room smelled of leather, damp wool, and clean ash. A decanter stood untouched on the desk beside a neat stack of correspondence weighted with a brass hound. Every object in the room looked placed by rule. She sat dripping rainwater onto Aubusson roses and tried not to stain what she could not afford to replace in 3 lifetimes. Julian watched her with grave concentration. "You are hurt, too." "It is slight," she said automatically. Hartrose's gaze flicked to her face with that same hard impatience. She looked away first, to the child, and held out her hands. "Show me your palm." Julian glanced at his uncle for permission. Hartrose gave a short nod. She moved to the settee and unwrapped the linen layer by layer. The first strip had bled through at one corner, but not heavily. Good. Her own breath loosened by a fraction. She inspected the edges in firelight. Fine cut, clean. No embedded grit that she could see. "Harker!" she said, then checked herself. "Forgive me, Mr. Harker, may we have a bowl of warm water and clean cloth?" Before the footman could answer, Hartrose said, "Bring it!" Harker went at once. Julian shifted, jaw set against fear. "Will the surgeon use stitches?" "Perhaps one," she said. "Perhaps none. You did the difficult part already." "What was that?" "Not fainting in a cold garden. It is an underrated talent." His mouth twitched. A child's brief, unwilling smile. Then it vanished. By the time the long clock near the map cabinet marked 11:15, the house had begun to breathe again beyond the study walls, but only in fragments. A door closing too fast, shoes hurrying on runner carpets, low instructions passed from man to man. Harker returned with steaming water, lint, and a fresh roll of linen. Margaret washed her hands quickly, teeth pressed into her lower lip against the sting in the split skin, then cleaned Julian's cut with steady fingers while he stared at the fire and counted each breath under his breath as if counting were armour. When she finished the second binding, the knot sat flat and firm at the heel of his hand. Hartrose stepped closer, inspected once and gave the smallest incline of his head. A knock came, then another without waiting for answer. The door opened, Mrs. Webber entered in peacock silk and controlled alarm. Lucinda and Anne behind her like mirrored ornaments, all perfume and bright concern. "Mrs." Webber stopped when she saw Margaret kneeling by the settee with blood-tinged linen in her lap. The concern vanished. Something harder replaced it. "There you are," she said. Her voice was sweet enough to curdle. I have searched every corridor while you make yourself useful in rooms where you have no standing." Julian flinched at the sharpness. Margaret rose at once and moved half a pace so she stood between the boy and Mrs. Webber without seeming to do so. The motion was instinctive. She felt Hartrow register it without looking at him. Mrs. Webber dipped a curtsy to the Duke, silk rustling. "Your Grace, I am distressed beyond words. What a dreadful accident. Children do dash about so. I told my household to keep strict order, yet—" Her eyes cut to Margaret. "Some people mistake commotion for opportunity." "State your purpose, Mrs. Webber," Hartrow said. Lucinda's fan snapped open, though there was no heat to justify it. Anne stared at Julian's hand, then at Margaret's skirt hem, where the torn petticoat edge showed beneath wet wool. Her smile sharpened. She ripped her own things for effect, perhaps. Margaret kept her voice level. "I tore linen for pressure, Miss Webber." Mrs. Webber ignored her. "Your Grace, if the child has taken fright, it may soothe him to hear from a familiar household face that no one blames him. Margaret can say he was merely clumsy and that she arrived too late to be of real help. Such details prevent gossip from growing in foolish directions." The room went very still. Fire popped once in the grate. Julian looked up, confusion and alarm tangling in his expression. "But she helped at once." Mrs. Webber gave him a smile that never reached her eyes. "Naturally, darling, we speak only of emphasis." Margaret felt the old training rise. Say yes. Smooth the surface. Preserve yourself by agreeing with the nearest power. It had kept her fed, barely, for years. It had also buried her inch by inch. She heard her father's voice as clearly as if he stood at her shoulder with a ledger open. "Read the margin." She said, "I cannot say that, ma'am." Mrs. Webber turned her head, very slow. "You cannot." "I will not tell him he imagined what happened." Colour climbed Mrs. Webber's throat. "You forget yourself." "I remember myself with effort," Margaret said quietly, and knew as she spoke that the line would cost her. Hartrow had not moved. He stood near the desk with one hand on the carved chair back, expression unreadable, watching not with the idle curiosity of a guest, but with the stillness of judgment. Mrs. Webber took 2 quick steps and struck Margaret across the face. The sound cracked through the room. Lucinda gave a tiny gasp that might have been delight. Anne looked away, then back, hungry not to miss anything. Margaret's head turned with the blow. Heat flared across her cheek. She did not lift a hand to it. Julian made a small, wounded noise and started to stand. She reached back without looking and set her uninjured hand lightly against his sleeve, keeping him seated. "Do not rise," she said to him, voice steady despite the ringing in her ear. Mrs. Webber's breath came quick now, composure fraying. "You insolent creature! In my house!" "Not while he is frightened," Margaret said. "If you must strike someone, strike me, in the passage." Hartrow spoke then, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "No one strikes anyone in this room." Mrs. Webber faced him, smile assembled in pieces. "Your Grace, she is overwrought. She forgets discipline." "I observe discipline in the garden," he said. "I observe cruelty here." Silence answered him. Even Lucinda lowered her fan. A second knock cut the tension. Harker opened to admit Mr. Vale, the surgeon, carrying a leather case dark with rain. He bowed quickly, took in the room with one professional sweep, and crossed to Julian. "Let us see what we have, Master Ashford." Margaret stepped aside at once. Vale unwrapped the linen, examined the cut, nodded. "Cleaned and compressed properly. Who bound this?" No one spoke for a breath. Then Julian said, "Miss Webber did." Vale glanced up, surprised to find her there in a soaked dress with a bright handprint rising on her cheek. "Then Miss Webber saved me 10 minutes, and the boy some misery. I shall place one small stitch. Mrs. Webber's mouth tightened. How fortunate! The surgeon worked quickly. Julian stared at the mantel clock and recited multiplication tables under his breath, while Margaret stood near enough for him to see her if he looked, far enough not to interfere. When the stitch was tied and the final wrap set, Vale gave strict instructions for rest and for no rough play with that hand for 3 days. Hartrow listened as if taking military orders. Mrs. Webber listened as if evaluating expense. As Vale repacked his instruments, another footman appeared at the door, uncertain. "Your Grace, the gentlemen ask whether Lord Benedict shall reassure the assembly that all is well." Hartrow answered without turning. "My brother will say the child is safe and that the musical has ended." The footman hesitated, then looked toward Margaret. "Yes, there is also inquiry regarding Miss Webber's absence from service." Mrs. Webber opened her mouth. Margaret spoke first. "The fault is mine," she said. "The livery order instructed us to fetch a footman and do nothing more. I went to the garden myself." Harker shifted almost imperceptibly behind her. The messenger in Ashford colours, waiting in the hall, stiffened as if prepared to correct the record. Hartrow lifted one finger. Silence settled again. Julian looked stricken. "You did not do wrong." Margaret met his eyes. "I broke instruction. I would do it again, but no one else is to be blamed for my choice. It was the simplest way to end it. A servant disobeyed, punishable, contained. Better that than Harker questioned, kitchen maids dismissed, messenger reprimanded for delay that had not existed. Houses like this devoured the lowest rung first when panic needed a scapegoat. Hartrow understood. She saw it in the slight narrowing of his gaze. Not anger, but recognition of the calculus she had made in a single sentence. Mrs. Webber seized the opening at once. "You hear her, Your Grace. She confesses impropriety before witnesses. I shall remove her from duty tonight and see that she offers apologies where required." Julian gripped the blanket with his good hand. "No, she stays." "Master Julian," Mrs. Webber said with sugared firmness, "adults are speaking." The child's lower lip trembled once, then steadied by force. "She kept me from bleeding on the glass. She told me men may breathe loudly. She did not lie." He looked to his uncle. "Please." Something shifted in Hartrow's face then, subtle and terrible in its restraint. He crossed to the settee and rested one hand on Julian's shoulder, anchor and command at once. "Miss Webber will remain until you sleep," he said. Mrs. Webber drew a breath to object. He turned his head. "You may return to your guests, Mrs. Webber." There was no room in the sentence for debate. She curtsied too low, silk whispering like a blade drawn from sheath, and backed toward the door with her daughters retreating around her in offended silence. At the threshold she looked once at Margaret's cheek and gave a smile thin as wire. "This is not finished." The door closed behind them. For the first time in the evening, quiet held, not peace, merely the absence of immediate attack. Vale gave final instructions to Harker and departed. The messenger went with him. The footman extinguished one lamp and withdrew, leaving firelight and 2 candles. Julian's composure collapsed by degrees now that spectators were gone. His chin quivered. He pressed it hard against his chest as if shame could force tears back into his skull. Margaret crouched beside him. "May I tell you a disgraceful secret?" she asked softly. He nodded without looking up. "I once fainted in the records room at Lincoln's Inn from hunger and woke with my face against a box of tax affidavits. The clerk told everyone I had been conquered by arithmetic." A damp laugh escaped him despite himself. "Were you?" "Completely. Figures are merciless." His breathing eased. He leaned, hesitant, against the back cushion, and after a moment his head tipped toward her shoulder. She went still so as not to disturb him. She began, very low, to recite from memory a passage in Latin her father had taught her for restless nights. The consonants settled the air. She translated each line into plain English under her breath, not because a 7-year-old required classical comfort, but because rhythm steadied pain when reason could not. She did not know Hartrow had moved to the doorway between study and hall until she felt, rather than saw his attention, a physical line across her skin. She kept reciting. Julian's lashes lowered, his breathing lengthened. The hand not wrapped in bandage loosened at last on the blanket. When she finished, the Duke said from the doorway, very quietly, "What text was that?" She turned, careful not to wake the child. "Virgil, Your Grace." "You learned it where?" "My father taught me." He watched her another long moment, rain-dark coat now drying in sharp folds by the fire. "You will not return to the service passages tonight." She held his gaze. Her cheek throbbed where the handprint had begun to deepen. "Mrs. Weber will object." "Yes." He stepped fully into the room, storm-coloured eyes, jaw set, voice low enough that only she could hear. "Let her!" Margaret held the back of the chair to steady herself, not from fear of him, but from the strange, dangerous relief in his tone. Men with rank made promises every day and broke them before supper. This did not sound like promise. It sounded like verdict. Julian shifted against the cushions, his lashes heavy, his good hands still fisted in the blanket. Hartrow lowered his voice. "He will sleep if the house remains quiet. Mrs. Weber will not keep quiet in these rooms." "That has never prevented her," Margaret said, before caution could return. Her cheek burned where the handprint spread. Her side wound had begun to pull again where damp cloth stuck to skin. His gaze dropped to that movement with surgical precision. "You are bleeding through." She looked down and saw a faint dark crescent along the seam. "It is old." "It is open." He stepped to the bell pull and rang once. Harker entered at once, as if he had been waiting on the other side of the door. Hartrow did not glance away from Margaret when he spoke. "Warm broth, bread, clean linen, my housekeeper, now." Harker's eyes flicked to Margaret's face, took in the handprint, then returned to neutral. "At once, Your Grace." He withdrew. Margaret felt colour rise under the bruise on her cheek. "Your Grace, I cannot be attended in your study. If Mrs. Weber learns that I was fed here, she will dismiss 2 kitchen maids for indulgence." He answered without delay. "Then she will explain those dismissals to me." "She will deny them." "She will try." The fire settled with a low hiss. Julian breathed in uneven little drags, not fully asleep yet, hovering near it. Margaret crossed to him and eased the blanket higher around his shoulders. The boy leaned toward her by instinct, then stilled when he remembered discipline and looked toward his uncle for approval. Hartrow gave one short nod. Julian let his head rest against Margaret's arm. When the long clock in the passage struck 11, each note carried through the panelled walls like a measured warning. Hartrow moved to the settee and sat on the far edge, leaving space for the child and, for her, broad shoulders held rigidly square, hands flat on his knees, as if any softer posture would be concession. He looked at Julian, not at her. "He heard Sir Matthew at cards," he said. "The man was drunk. He spoke of the late Duchess as if grief were entertainment." His jaw tightened along the old scar. "Julian has not heard those details." Margaret kept her voice low. "Children always hear the sentence meant for another room." Hartrow turned his head a fraction. "You speak as if from practice." "My father died in his study. Men discussed his debts in our front hall while I stood behind the door." She adjusted the blanket edge so it did not rub the child's stitched palm. They used words they believed I did not understand. His eyes held hers in the firelight. Did you understand them? All of them. He looked away first to the desk where correspondence lay in severe, neat stacks. Yes, he said, as if confirming a private conclusion. A soft knock came. Mrs. Davies entered with a tray herself, not trusting any younger hand to manage this room tonight. She had changed her apron, but not her shoes. Kitchen ash still marked one hem. Behind her came a tall woman in plain black wool, silver hair beneath a strict cap, posture straight as a pike. Hartrow rose. Mrs. Fenwick, this is Miss Webber. The housekeeper inclined her head to Margaret. Nothing in her face suggested surprise, but her eyes were sharp and kind in equal measure. Miss Webber. Mrs. Davies set the tray on a side table, and, after one searching look at Margaret's cheek, busied herself with the broth to hide what she felt. Hartrow gestured once toward Julian. He remains here tonight. Harker at the door. No guest enters without my word. Mrs. Fenwick answered, Yes, Your Grace. He added, Miss Webber is not to return to Mrs. Webber's service passages. The room went very still. Mrs. Davies did not spill a drop, but her hand paused above the ladle. Mrs. Fenwick's expression did not change. Understood, Margaret found her voice. Your Grace, you are generous in a moment of disturbance, but you cannot remove me from that household by instructions spoken in anger. I have no wages, no reference, and no place to go before dawn. At that he faced her fully. I'm not angry. She almost laughed, not from humour, but from sheer strain. Then what is this? This is correction. He crossed to the desk and opened the top drawer. From inside he drew a folded sheaf tied with narrow black ribbon, the paper worn at the edges, as if handled often. He set it on the blotter and untied it with deliberate care. Margaret saw at once the shape of familiar columns, dates, initials cramped in margins. Her breath caught. My father's renewal notes, she said. Copies, Hartrow replied. The originals are in Pritchard's strong room. These were supplied to me after I made inquiry 3 weeks ago. She stared at him. Why would you make inquiry into my father's accounts? Because my steward reported irregular signatures linked to a property transfer touching Ashford lands. Because your father's name appeared where it should not. Because the figures shifted in ways that suggested someone expected no one to calculate them twice. His voice remained even. Because your handwriting appears in the margins of 12 separate household ledgers, correcting arithmetic no servant was asked to review. A faint tremor ran through her hands. She clasped them behind her back. You had my things searched. I had records examined that bore my tenant's seals. I did not enter your room. He paused. I did have your attic lock replaced when it was found broken last month. She looked up sharply. That was you. Mrs. Webber told her staff rats had damaged it. Rats do not file brass. The knowledge struck like cold water. She had returned from market to find the lock suddenly whole, the loose boards beneath her bed undisturbed, and had thanked chance in silence because there had been no safer explanation. Chance had not done it. The Duke had watched a danger she had not known he could see. Missit is morning he needs us sees. Davies carried a bowl toward Margaret and stopped when Hartrow lifted a hand. Set it there, he said quietly. She will eat when she is seated. I can stand, Margaret said. You can obey. His tone did not rise. Sit. The command landed with the same force as in the winter garden. This time she heard what sat under it. Not dominance for its own sake. Containment, as if he were drawing a line against collapse, and had no gentler tool within reach. She sat. Mrs. Davies pressed bread into her hand, then retreated with wet eyes she refused to wipe. Mrs. Fenwick moved to Julian, checked his blanket, and returned to the door without speaking. Hartrow remained standing by the desk, one hand braced on the carved edge, watching until Margaret lifted the spoon. The broth was hot enough to sting her split lip. She swallowed anyway. Heat spread through an empty stomach and made her dizzy. She said, "You cannot stand there all night to ensure I finish." He did not move. "Watch me." The words should have sounded arrogant. They sounded like oath. From the hall came rapid steps, then a restrained knock. Harker opened to Lord Benedict Ashford, coat unbuttoned, cravat askew from haste, expression strained with concern that had not yet learned where to settle. He stopped when he saw Margaret at the table, Julian half asleep, and his brother standing sentinel at the desk, like a carved figurehead in a storm. "Is he safe?" Benedict asked. Hartrow answered, "Yes." Benedict crossed to the settee, crouched and brushed 2 fingers over Julian's hair without waking him. Relief softened his mouth for one brief moment before he turned to Margaret and saw her cheek. "Who struck you?" She set the spoon down. "It is not of consequence, my lord." "It is to me," Hartrow said. "Mrs. Webber." Benedict's head came up. "In this room?" "In my presence," Hartrow said. A hard silence followed. Benedict stood slowly and faced his brother. "Then the musicale is finished for more reasons than one." "It is finished," Hartrow said. Benedict looked between them, reading currents Margaret could feel but not name. He spoke more carefully. "Guests are unsettled. Sir Matthew has been removed to his carriage. I told the assembly the child was overtired. They accepted what was convenient." "They always do," Margaret said, before she could stop herself. Benedict gave her a brief, pained glance that held no mockery. "Miss Weber, I am sorry for what was spoken under this roof tonight." Hartrow's eyes cut to his brother. "See the last guests out, then return." Benedict did not argue. He bowed once to Margaret, once to the sleeping boy, and left. The door closed. Quiet returned with the fire's pulse and Julian's small breaths. Margaret finished the broth because not finishing would now be a form of defiance she did not possess strength to stage. Hartrow watched every swallow with that same unnerving stillness, as if the simple act of feeding her had become a matter of state. When she had done, Mrs. Fenwick stepped forward with clean linen and a small ceramic pot of salve. "Miss Weber," she said, practical and gentle, "if you permit, I can see to the cut at your side behind the screen." Margaret's throat tightened. Kindness offered plainly had become rare enough to hurt. "Thank you." Hartrow moved toward the hearth and turned his back while Mrs. Fenwick guided Margaret behind a folding screen near the map cabinet. The older woman's hands were brisk and respectful. She did not ask for explanation. She cleaned the shallow wound, set salve, bound it with neat strips, and handed Margaret a fresh chemise from a wrapped parcel that smelled of lavender starch. "This was sent from the Blue Room," she said. "No one will claim it from you." Margaret changed with fingers that trembled less than before. When she stepped out, Hartrow still stood exactly where he had turned away. Gaze fixed on the fire, posture unchanged. He had not crossed the room, he had not tested boundaries. He had simply remained as if movement itself might be misread. Mrs. Fenwick inclined her head to him. "She is tended." "Thank you," he said. The housekeeper and Mrs. Davies withdrew with the tray, leaving only Harker at the door. Margaret looked at the sleeping child, then at the Duke. "You trust me with him more than his own household does?" "I trust what I have seen." "In one night?" He shook his head once. "Not one night?" The answer settled between them, heavy as iron. She felt suddenly the full weight of being observed across weeks she had believed belonged only to survival. The reordered kindling slips, the corrected columns, the attic lock replaced in silence, the winter garden, the study. He had seen and said nothing until saying became irreversible. She folded her hands to hide their shake. Why intervene now? His face hardened, not in anger, but in old pain she could not map. Because tonight she struck you in front of my nephew and called it discipline. Because you accepted blame to protect servants who outrank you only when punishment is required. Because you have been starving in a house that spends more on rose water than coal. He took one step closer. Because I have watched you disappear by inches, and I am done watching. The room narrowed to firelight and the distance between them. He spoke each sentence like a sealed instrument, each one binding him as much as her. You are covered in bruises. His gaze moved to her mended cuff, her split knuckles, the shadowed hollows beneath her eyes. You have been hungry for days. His jaw tightened on the final line, scar pulling white against skin. You will not return upstairs. Margaret drew breath and could not shape an answer at once. No one had ever named her condition without either pity or contempt. He named it as fact and as indictment, and in that naming there was a ferocity that frightened her less than gentleness would have done. Gentleness could be withdrawn. This felt like stone. In the corridor, distant voices thinned as the final carriages rolled away. The house emptied itself of witnesses. Hartrow did not move back. He did not reach for her. He simply stood and waited with the implacable stillness of a man who had issued a command he could not unsay. At last she found her voice. If I do not return, Mrs. Webber will come here herself. His mouth set. Then let her knock. The knock came at once, 3 measured strikes, and Hartrow's gaze held Margaret's, as if the wood of the door were already speaking. Enter, he said. Harker opened to Mrs. Webber, still in peacock silk, with Lucinda and Anne behind her, and Lord Benedict a step farther back, his expression drawn tight from whatever he had seen in the drawing-room below. Mrs. Webber did not cross the threshold until she had looked from Margaret's fresh bandage to the child sleeping on the settee, and judged the arrangement intolerable. Your Grace, she said, each syllable lacquered smooth, my household cannot proceed while this girl is hidden in a gentleman's private rooms. Guests are asking questions, Hartrow answered. Then let them ask better ones. Mrs. Webber's smile thinned. I require Miss Webber in the drawing-room now. Margaret spoke before he could. If I am required, I will come. Hartrow turned his head, and the old scar at his jaw pulled pale. You will not be alone. By 11:05, the drawing-room had been reduced to a hard ring of witnesses who had failed to leave when decency advised it. Candles burned low in crystal branches. Wax had spilled in little frozen tears along silver stands. Wet cloaks scented the air with wool and street rain. Sir Matthew's chair near the card table stood empty. Abandoned glass beside it, the mark of his earlier cruelty still present as if furniture could remember. Margaret entered between Harker and Mrs. Fenwick, not as servant and not as guest, and every eye followed the fading handprint on her cheek. Mrs. Webber moved to the centre carpet and lifted her chin. My stepdaughter has behaved with reckless impropriety, she announced. She has defied direct instruction from His Grace's own messenger and attached herself to noble attention in a manner I cannot permit under my roof. A rustle moved through the room. Lucinda lowered her gaze in a performance of sorrow. Anne pressed a handkerchief to her lips, waiting for approval she always took from her mother's face. Lord Benedict stepped forward before anyone else could speak. He looked at Margaret, and there was no mockery in him, only urgency and a kind of formal kindness that came too late and still meant something. Miss Webber, he said, voice carrying to the mirrors, if your difficulty is shelter and name, allow me to offer both. I ask for your hand. Silence fell so quickly that Margaret heard rain against the far windows, and Julian's small cough from the corridor where Harker's second man waited with him. Benedict continued, steady though colour had risen in his face. "I offer respect, immediate removal from this household, and my word that no past indignity will be spoken of again under my protection." Gasps answered him. A lady near the pianoforte dropped her fan. Mrs. Webber's eyes widened, not with joy, but with abrupt calculation. She turned to Margaret with a triumph she could not conceal. "Well," she said softly, "you are fortunate beyond merit. Answer his lordship?" Margaret looked at Benedict. He was warm where his brother was stone, open where his brother was withheld. He would have been easy to accept in that room, easy and wrong. Hartrow had not moved from the doorway. Rain-dark coat, hands at his sides, eyes on her face and nowhere else. "Do not answer yet," he said. The sentence crossed the drawing-room like a blade set flat on a table. Benedict went still. Mrs. Webber spun toward the Duke. "Your Grace, this is a family matter." "No," Hartrow said. "This is forgery." He lifted one hand. The door opened behind him to admit 2 magistrates' officers in dark coats and, between them, a narrow man with iron-grey whiskers, carrying a leather dispatch case. Margaret recognised him from childhood visits to chambers. Mr. Pritchard's senior clerk, Mr. Elwell, who could recite a bond from memory after one reading, and had once given her a sugared almond while her father argued in court. Mrs. Webber's colour changed under powder. "What is this intrusion?" Elwell bowed to Hartrow, then to the room. "By request of His Grace, I have examined instruments lodged under the name of the late Mr. Tobias Weber. Several are fraudulent extensions executed after Mr. Weber's death. Signature lifts are evident, amounts altered in later ink. Beneficiary accounts traced to Mrs. Helena Weber." He opened the case and set documents on the card table, one by one. Wax seals, renewal notes, transfer slips. Margaret's own copied columns, neat and exact, now matched line for line against originals. Hartrow said, "Miss Webber." Mrs. Fenwick placed a small ledger bundle in Margaret's hands, wrapped in worn apron linen, her hidden notebook from beneath the attic boards. She had not retrieved it. Someone had preserved it for her. Margaret stepped forward, pulse hammering, and laid the notebook beside Elwell's papers. "These are my copies of household entries for 4 years," she said. "Dates, sums, and where the sums should have gone. My dowry listed as operating reserve. Library sale proceeds marked as furnace repair. Coal charged twice each week through winters when no coal reached the attic room." Elwell turned pages with quick, professional fingers. "Corroborated." Mrs. Webber laughed once, high and brittle. "The fantasies of an embittered girl." Margaret met her gaze. "Then why did you file brass from my attic lock?" A murmur ran through the guests. Lucinda took one step back. Anne's handkerchief dropped to the floor. Hartrow spoke to the officers without raising his voice. "Execute the warrant." The first officer unfolded parchment and read charges of forged instruments, unlawful transfer, and fraudulent debt extension. Mrs. Webber attempted dignity. It slipped when they took her wrists, not roughly, only with routine certainty. She looked to Benedict, then to the ladies who had praised her musicale, and found no rescue in either direction. "You cannot do this in front of guests." Hartrow's face did not change. "You struck Miss Weber in front of guests." Mrs. Webber was led out past the same chairs where she had displayed charity all season. Lucinda began to cry in small, frightened sounds. Anne followed her mother without speaking. No one stopped them. No one offered a cloak. Benedict stood very still until the doors closed. then exhaled and looked at Margaret as if accepting a verdict against himself. "My offer was clumsy," he said quietly. "It was not pity, but it was still a rescue. You deserved to choose without an audience." She answered with the honesty he had given her. "Thank you for meaning honour." He bowed. "If Julian requires me, tomorrow I remain. If you require witness for any hearing, send to Ashford House and my carriage comes." "I will." He glanced once toward his brother, and the unfinished thing between them settled into something older and cleaner than rivalry. "Take care of her, Elias," Hartrow said. "I intend to." By midnight the last carriage had gone, and rain had thinned to mist over the black lawns. Margaret stood in the winter garden where broken glass had been swept, and only one cloche remained cracked at the rim, a small reminder no servant had yet removed. Orange leaves shone with damp. Gravel held the prints of boots now filling slowly with water. Hartrow came to stand beside her, not touching. "My brother asked first," he said. "I will not take your answer from him by rank." She wrapped her fingers tighter around the warmed shawl Mrs. Davies had given her at the door. "He offered safety." "I offer terms." He handed her a folded paper. "Read." In the lantern light she saw clauses in his precise hand, witnessed by Elwell below. Restoration of her dowry and maternal library from seized assets. Immediate filing in Chancery under Hartrow Council at his expense. Residence at Hartrow House with independent allowance in her own name. A marriage by special licence if she consented. A 6-month provision allowing annulment petition initiated by her alone if affection did not grow and no coercion proved. She looked up, throat tight. "This is not a cage." "No, it is not charity either." "No." Rain ticked softly on glass above them. His face remained carved and controlled, but his hands were not still now. One thumb moved once along the edge of his signet ring. A tell so slight most would have missed it. She did not miss it. "You have watched me a long while," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He held her gaze. "Because you were the most precise mind in a house built on theft. Because you stepped between cruelty and a child when no one would reward it. Because when you were unseen, you were still honourable." The lantern flame trembled in a draught. She heard, far off, Julian laughing once in his sleep as Benedict and Mrs. Fenwick settled him in the blue room. The sound reached the garden and faded. Margaret folded the paper with careful hands. "I will not be rescued in public and erased in private," she said. "I choose the man who saw me before he wanted me." Hartrow bowed his head once, as if receiving command rather than consent. "Then we marry on your terms." 3 days later, under a pale morning sky and a wind that smelled of wet stone, they stood in the small chapel off Hartrow's west gallery, with Elwell, Mrs. Fenwick, Mrs. Davies, Benedict, and 2 silent footmen as witnesses. Margaret wore plain ivory wool and her mother's cameo, recovered from a locked drawer and returned by court order at dawn. Hartrow wore black and silver, no decoration beyond his ring. When the vicar asked for assent, Hartrow answered first, voice low and absolute. Margaret answered without tremor. Elwell passed the register. She signed Margaret Webber Ashford in the exact hand her father had taught her. Hartrow signed beneath. Benedict signed next and pressed sand over the ink with unusual care, as if guarding it from smudge were a final service. Outside the chapel, Benedict knelt to Julian's height and showed him how to hold a kite frame against the wind without straining his healing palm. Julian listened solemnly, then laughed when the paper tail snapped straight and bright against the clouds. The sound carried across the terrace and did not break. 6 months later, in the first warm week of May, Margaret sat in Hartro's walled garden with a book open on her lap, her mother's restored library now filling 3 long shelves in the morning room by her own order of language and law. Julian slept against her shoulder, taller already, stitched scar faded to a thin pale crescent in his palm. Bees moved through late roses. Beyond the yew arch, clerks from Pritchard's office loaded final recovered account chests for delivery to her steward, each chest sealed and inventoried in her presence. Hartro came down the path and stopped before her chair. He looked at the sleeping child, then at the book in her hand, then at her face with that same unflinching attention that had once felt like danger and now felt like home earned slowly. "He has asked Benedict to teach him figures this summer," he said. "He will terrify every tutor by Michaelmas." A brief movement touched Hartro's mouth, not quite a smile. He rested one hand on the back of her chair, careful not to wake Julian. "I have never asked this of anyone." She closed the book over one finger to keep her place. "Ask." "Stay." She lifted her free hand to his wrist and held it there, warm skin over steady pulse. "Yes," she said.